Colorado Territory, autumn 1879. The wind had shifted. Elias Whitaker paused mid-swing, the hammer in his hand hovering inches above a splintered fence post. Something in the air, a change in pressure, a silence deeper than quiet, caught the edge of his attention like a whisper just out of reach. Then came the gunshots, sharp cracks, 4 in all. The first 2 rang close together, the third slower, the fourth more distant. Then nothing. No echoes, no birdsong, just the breeze moving through the dying grass. Elias set the hammer down slowly, the way a man does when he knows what comes next might demand a different kind of tool. He glanced toward the hills, the way a hunter tracks movement in trees, and reached for his rifle leaning against the fence rail. 3 years on this land had taught him the sounds of everything it held: the coyote's yip, the hawk's screech, the clatter of mule hooves on stone. But that rhythm, that pattern, it didn't belong here. Not hunting, not target practice. Desperation. The rifle fit his shoulder like memory. He didn't bother locking the cabin before he left. He hadn't needed to in months. He moved east, boots whispering against frost-hardened soil, past the old cottonwood near the stream, toward the canyon locals called Devil's Draw. He never liked the name. Sounded too final. As he climbed, Elias passed the small hill where Clara was buried. Her grave was simple: a cedar cross, the wood worn smooth by wind, a few stones neatly arranged around its base. He stopped just long enough to brush off a clump of leaves and whisper, "Stay with me." It wasn't prayer, not exactly, but it was close. Clara would have understood. She always had. Up ahead, the ridge narrowed, red rock giving way to pines that clawed at the sky like fingers in warning. He crouched low, the smell of cold iron in his nose. Then, slowly, carefully, he looked down into the canyon. 3 men lay still, scattered across sand and brush like broken dolls. One sprawled near the rocks, a rifle dropped beside him. Another slumped against a tree trunk, head lolled at an unnatural angle. The third, face down in creek water, still clutched a revolver in a lifeless grip. But it wasn't the dead that stopped Elias in his tracks. It was the fourth figure. She crouched behind a boulder, half shrouded by shadow, clutching her shoulder with one hand and holding a small knife in the other. Long black hair spilled over her buckskin sleeve, her breathing shallow but steady. Even from this distance, Elias could tell she wasn't just injured, she was hunted. He exhaled slowly. This was the kind of moment Clara used to speak about in the quiet hours between dusk and sleep. When the Lord puts someone in your path, she'd say, you either step forward in mercy or walk away in shame. There's no third road. Elias raised his empty hand high above the rim of the canyon and stepped forward, slow and deliberate. No sudden moves, no raised weapon. "Miss," he called out gently, "I mean you no harm." Her eyes found his, dark as river stone, narrowed with pain and suspicion. She didn't answer. "My name's Elias Whitaker. I live 2 ridges west. You're hurt." Still silence. "I can help," he said, more to the wind than to her. "No obligation, just help." The woman didn't move at first. Then, with the careful dignity of someone who's had to measure every inch of trust in ounces, she gave a small nod. Elias slung his rifle and began the climb down, unaware that with each step he took toward her, he was stepping into a story that would undo everything he thought he understood about solitude, justice, and the quiet miracles that sometimes arrive on 4 hooves and an open heart. Elias moved through the ravine with measured steps, boots sliding on loose shale, rifle strapped to his back, hands in clear sight. The young woman didn't flinch as he approached, but he could see the tension in her jaw, the silent calculation in her eyes. Her knife remained steady, its blade darkened with blood. His guess was it wasn't hers alone. He crouched a few feet away, not close enough to invade, but near enough to offer. "You're bleeding," he said quietly. Her voice surprised him, low, clear, composed despite her condition. "They shot me, but I was faster." Elias glanced back at the bodies. The math didn't add up. 3 men dead, and she was still upright, if barely. There was more to her than met the eye. "I believe that," he said. "Still, you'll need help if you're going to keep surviving." She looked at him for a long moment, then slowly lowered the knife. "I'm called Nita," she said, "and I don't belong to them. That part's clear." The wound was to her upper left shoulder, a clean graze by the looks of it, but bleeding steadily. Elias tore a strip from the linen undershirt beneath his coat and offered it. She hesitated, then took it and pressed it to the wound with the sharp intake of someone who's had to treat herself too many times. "I've got more supplies at my cabin," he said. "It's a mile, maybe less if we take the east slope. You can rest. I've got clean water, bandages, fire." Her brow furrowed. "And if I say no?" "You walk away," Elias replied simply. "That's all." Something softened in her expression. Not trust exactly, but the first stirring of it. "I can walk," she said. "You don't have to," Elias offered, stepping closer. "You've lost blood." She didn't argue, only nodded once. He fashioned a makeshift sling from his scarf and helped her to her feet. She hissed softly, but bore the pain with a pride he recognized. War had carved that same resolve into men twice her size. They climbed out of the canyon in silence, broken only by the occasional shift of stone and her controlled breathing. The sky above them burned orange with the last light of day. Elias noted the gathering clouds cresting the far ridge. Snow by morning, perhaps. By the time they reached his cabin, Nita was shaking with fatigue. Elias pushed the door open with his shoulder and guided her inside. The cabin was modest. 1 room, a stone hearth, table, bedrolls neatly folded, books lining rough-hewn shelves. It smelled of cedar smoke and boiled coffee. Everything had a place. Nita glanced around as he helped her into a chair near the fire. Her eyes lingered on a small wooden cross hanging by the hearth, carved with care and wear-polished from years of touch. "You live alone?" she asked. "Yes." "For how long?" "Since Clara passed," he said. He didn't expect to say it. The words came out anyway. 3 years. First winter took her. Nita lowered her gaze respectfully. "I'm sorry." "She's buried on the hill, just west of the stream," Elias added, his voice quieter now. "I still talk to her sometimes. Don't know if she answers." Nita met his eyes. Sometimes silence speaks more than words. Elias gave a short nod, then turned to boil water and lay out supplies. His hands were steady. War had taught him that much. He cleaned the wound gently, pausing when Nita tensed. "It's a clean pass," he murmured. "You are lucky." "Lucky's not a word I use much," she replied. "But thank you." When he finished binding the shoulder, she exhaled sharply and leaned back, eyes closed. "I won't stay long," she said, "just until I can move again." "You'll stay as long as you need," Elias said, then paused. "No expectations, no payment." She opened her eyes again, studying him. "Why?" she asked. He shrugged. "Clara used to say, 'If you cannot save a soul when it stands before you, what is your faith worth?' I reckon I still believe that." For the first time, Nita smiled. Not wide, not sure, but real. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, something fragile and wordless began to take root. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The next morning came cold and brittle, a breath of frost tracing every window pane. Elias rose early, out of habit, his body still tuned to wartime watches, though the war had long since ended. He lit the stove, boiled water, and quietly ground coffee while the fire came to life. Nita was still asleep, her breathing soft and even from the bedroll across the cabin. She looked smaller in rest, though no less guarded. One hand lay curled near her bandaged shoulder, the other under her blanket, as if she still expected to reach for a blade. Elias didn't disturb her. He stepped outside into the stillness, the kind that only came in the mountain dawn. He took comfort in chores. The world could be full of chaos, but water still needed hauling, logs still needed splitting. These things did not lie. He was stacking the last of the cut wood when he heard the cabin door creak. Nita stood in the doorway, blanket around her shoulders, eyes blinking against the sharp morning light. "Coffee?" Elias offered. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Please." Back inside, he poured her a mug, black and bitter. "Strong," she said after a sip. "Helps keep the cold out." They ate in silence, bread, dried venison, apples stewed with cinnamon. Elias wasn't one for small talk, and Nita seemed to appreciate that. "I need to clean the wound later," he said. She nodded, not flinching. "Any fever overnight?" "A little. Gone now." Her voice was steady, her eyes clear. She was healing quickly. Later, as he changed the dressing, she finally spoke. "My stepfather sold me," she said flatly. Elias didn't look up. "I was 16. Crawford offered money, said he wanted a proper wife. My stepfather said it was a good match for both his soul and his storehouse." Elias set the bloodied bandage aside, hands still. "I ran," she continued, "not because I was afraid to die, but because I was not meant to be owned." She said it with no rage, just fact, like a woman who had spent years deciding what not to carry anymore. Elias finished the binding, stood, and stepped back. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "that he thought you were something to sell." Nita didn't reply right away. Then, "You didn't ask what I did to those men in the canyon." "I figured they shot first." "They did," she said, "but I didn't wait long to shoot back." Elias gave a slow nod. "In the war," he said quietly, "I saw brave men break. I saw good men do terrible things because they had to. But you—" He stopped himself. Nita tilted her head. "You carry yourself like you've weathered storms longer than I have," he finished. She didn't smile, but her gaze softened. "Storms don't ask permission to come," she said. "They just teach you to stand up straight." They spent the rest of the day in measured rhythm. He chopped wood while she sorted herbs from her satchel, taught him names he'd never heard: bearberry, willow bark, wild hyssop. She moved with the ease of someone who knew the land in all its moods. That night, as snow whispered against the windows and the fire sighed in the hearth, Elias read from a small, worn Bible. Not aloud, he didn't think she'd want that, but just to himself. Yet when he looked up, he found Nita watching him. "Which verse?" she asked. He hesitated. Then, Psalm 91, about refuge, about angels guarding the road. She nodded once. "I used to hear that one long ago, in the mission school." They didn't speak again that evening. But when Elias banked the fire and rolled out his blanket across the room, he sensed something had shifted. Not quite safety, not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of both. Snow fell lightly that night, not heavy enough to stick, but enough to leave a thin veil on the grass by morning. Elias rose early, as he always did. He stirred the fire back to life and stepped outside into a silence that felt deeper than usual. He walked the northern fence line first, expecting to see the usual empty pasture beyond the rise. But when he reached the crest, he stopped cold. Cattle, 24, maybe more, grazing peacefully across his field like they'd always belonged there. No lowing, no dust, no signs of a drive or panic, just black coats against the frost-touched grass. Angus, mostly, a few rangy longhorns mixed in. Elias blinked, then looked for tracks. There were none. No broken brush along the outer perimeter, no drover's trail,
No signs of gates forced open. The barbed wire lines remained intact. The only thing disturbed was the stillness. He jogged back to the cabin, pulled on his coat. Nita sat by the fire, her wound dressed, her braid neat. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. "There's cattle in the north pasture," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Yours?" He shook his head. "Not unless the Lord started branding for me." That earned the barest twitch of her lips. They walked out together, Nita moving carefully but steadily. When she saw the herd, she didn't speak right away.
"They weren't here yesterday," Elias said. "No," she agreed. "They weren't." "Brand's unfamiliar," he muttered. "Not one I've seen in these parts." Nita stepped to the fence, fingers resting lightly on the post. "My people believe the earth repays quiet courage," she said softly. "So does heaven." Elias didn't answer. He stared at the animals. Healthy, calm, well-fed. They looked like money walking on 4 legs. Enough to buy winter feed, tools, maybe even a second horse. Enough to matter. "Hospitality to strangers," she murmured, as if to herself. He glanced at her. "Hebrews," she added, chapter 13, verse 2. "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing some have entertained angels unaware." Elias nodded slowly. "My Clara used to quote that one." "Then maybe she's the one who sent them." He gave a soft laugh, then stopped, because part of him wasn't sure it was a joke. That afternoon, he rode out to the nearest ranch to ask if anyone was missing cattle. No one was. He checked the county clerk's brand registry. No match. He stopped by Sheriff Granger's office. "You saying they just appeared?" the sheriff asked, brow raised.
"I'm saying they weren't there yesterday. No rustling reports, no missing stock. Sounds like a gift." Elias didn't like unexplained gifts. He rode home unsettled, the wind colder now, whispering secrets through the trees. That evening, he found Nita in the yard, watching the herd from the porch with her arms folded. She didn't say anything, and neither did he, for a while. Finally, she spoke. "I don't believe in coincidences," she said. "Neither do I," Elias replied. "Then maybe you already know why they came." He said nothing. She turned to him. "You helped someone who had nothing, gave shelter when it could have cost you everything." "I didn't do it for reward," he said. "I know," she replied. That night, the cattle stayed in the pasture, quiet, content, as if they knew they were home. Elias spent the next 3 days riding. He traced every trail he knew within a 10-mile radius, stopping at ranches, feed stores, even the blacksmith's shop where gossip ran like creek water. He described the brands, simple shapes, clean lines, unfamiliar patterns. No one recognized them. No one claimed any missing cattle. "No drives came through here lately," the smith told him. "And if someone had a herd like that, they wouldn't lose it quiet." Elias nodded, thanked the man, and rode on. He checked the territorial brand registry in town, rows of names and markings, but none matched what grazed in his pasture. At the sheriff's office, Amos Granger just leaned back in his chair and rubbed his jaw. "Sometimes you ask for rain," he said, "and the Lord sends a river." Elias frowned. "I didn't ask." "Didn't need to," the sheriff replied. "Maybe someone else did on your behalf." It was a long, silent ride home. That evening, as he unsaddled the mare and stowed his gear, Nita waited on the porch, a tin mug in her hands. The sky was streaked with violet and ash, and the cattle moved like shadows across the far edge of the field. "Anything?" she asked. He shook his head. "No one's missing them. No reports. No brands in the books." Nita didn't seem surprised. "I thought I'd feel better if I found the reason," Elias admitted. "But the not knowing, it feels like sitting in the dark waiting for lightning." She looked out toward the pasture. "Maybe not all gifts need explaining." He joined her on the steps.
They sat in companionable silence, the kind born not of awkwardness but of mutual weariness. After a while, she spoke again. "When I was a child, my mother told me stories about the land," she said. "She said it remembers kindness, that when someone acts with mercy, the earth sees, the sky sees, and sometimes they answer." Elias glanced at her. "Do you believe that?" "I want to." He nodded, then stared out at the herd. "I've lost more than I've kept," he said after a pause. "Since the war, since Clara. This land, this quiet, it was supposed to be a place to rebuild, but most days it just echoes louder than I can bear." Nita didn't reply with words. She simply reached over and handed him the mug. Warm cider, spiced. A small act, a gentle bridge. "Clara," he said finally, "used to read aloud in the evenings, psalms mostly. And when she got to the part about the Valley of Shadow, she'd always say, 'We walk through it, not into it. It's not the end, just the middle.'" Nita smiled faintly. "She sounds wise." She was. They stayed there until the fire inside beckoned and the chill settled in. When they finally rose, Elias held the door open and let Nita step inside first. That night, as he banked the coals, he paused by the window. The cattle were still there, still calm, still unclaimed. He whispered under his breath, unsure whether it was a prayer, a question, or just habit, "Lord, if this is a beginning, help me see it through." Across the room, Nita lay still, one arm tucked beneath her head. And for the first time in 3 years, Elias felt like maybe the house was holding more than memory. Maybe, just maybe, it was starting to hold life again. The first sign came at the general store. Elias had ridden into town for salt, flour, and new stitching thread for the harness straps. He didn't expect trouble, not that day. But when he stepped out of the store with his supplies, a stranger leaned against the rail post outside. Dusty coat, 2 new boots, and a hat pulled low enough to hide most of his face. "Mr. Whitaker," the man said smoothly. Elias kept walking. The man fell in step beside him. "You've got a good spread up there. Remote, private, nice grazing, I hear." Elias stopped, turned. "Don't believe we've met." The man smiled without warmth.
"I don't reckon we need to." He tipped his hat and strolled off, whistling a slow, familiar tune, one Elias recognized from the war. Not a soldier's march, a prison guard's dirge. The chill stayed in his bones all the way home. That evening, Nita watched him from across the table as he washed his hands in the basin. He didn't tell her everything, not yet, but she saw enough in the tight set of his jaw. "They found me," she said softly. Elias dried his hands slowly. "They're sniffing, that's all." "I've seen what comes after the sniffing." They sat in silence. "You should let me go," she said at last. "Soon." He didn't answer right away. The fire popped behind them. Outside, wind rattled the shutters. "You're not ready," he said. "Shoulders still healing. Weather's turning." "I've made it through worse." "That's not the point." Nita turned to face him fully. Her voice didn't rise, but it was firm. "It is to me." Elias looked away, jaw tight. "I didn't come here to stay," she added. "This was never meant to be a home." The words lodged like splinters. He stood, took her plate to the wash basin, rinsed it slowly, deliberately. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "I know." But his voice betrayed him. Nita rose too, crossed the small space between them, laid a hand on his arm. "I'm grateful," she said, "more than you know. But the longer I stay, the more danger follows." Elias didn't move. "I won't be the reason harm comes to you." He looked at her then, and she saw it. Beneath the steady surface, a storm held tightly in its cage. "You already changed this place," he said. "You brought more than cattle." She smiled gently. "I didn't bring the cattle, Elias." He gave a tired exhale. "Then someone or something did." She looked down, then back up. "I'll stay 2 more weeks, no longer." He nodded. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, they sat again by the fire, not touching, but near enough to feel the weight of what had not been said. After a long while, Elias spoke again. "When I lost Clara," he said, "I thought that was the end of the story. But now, I'm not sure it ever really ended. Maybe it just paused." Nita didn't respond with words. She leaned her head slightly toward the firelight and let the silence answer. The wind outside was colder than usual, sharper.
But neither of them reached for their coats. They simply sat, knowing something was coming, something close. The morning broke crisp and pale. A light dusting of snow covered the hills, just enough to mark tracks clearly. Elias saddled up, while Nita prepared a small pack, dried meat, biscuits, a tin cup. She moved easily now, favoring the shoulder less each day. Still, he kept a wary eye on her. "You sure about this?" he asked. Nita slung the pack over one shoulder. "It's time I earned my keep." They rode in silence through the cottonwoods along the creek, the horses' hooves muffled in the snow. The air smelled of pine resin and cold water. In the distance, a hawk cried once and was gone. At the foot of the ridge, they dismounted and tied the horses. "This way?" Nita said, crouching to examine the snow. "Buck came through last night, young one, still learning." Elias knelt beside her, watching as she pointed to faint indentations. "See how the back right hoof drags slightly? He favors that leg." "I wouldn't have seen that," Elias admitted. Nita looked over her shoulder. "Not everything worth knowing is in books, you know." They moved quietly through the trees, Nita leading with the poise of someone raised on such trails. Her bow hung over her back, handmade and worn smooth at the grip. Elias carried his rifle, but lowered respectfully. When they reached a rise overlooking a small hollow, Nita raised her hand to stop. "There," she whispered. A lone buck grazed at the edge of the clearing, its ears flicking at every sound. Nita motioned for Elias to stay, then stepped forward slowly, bow in hand. She didn't shoot. Instead, she paused, watched, waited. After a minute, the buck raised its head, stared directly at her. The air thickened, suspended. Then, with a flick of its tail, it bounded away, vanishing into the trees. Nita lowered her bow. "You let it go," Elias said when she returned. "It saw me," she said simply. "It was meant to leave." They sat on a fallen log, sharing the food they'd brought. Nita took out a piece of soft cloth and began rubbing down her bowstring. Elias studied her hands, remembering a time when silence meant loneliness. Now it was peace. "You ever sing?" she asked suddenly. Elias chuckled. "Not well." Nita smiled. "My mother taught me a lullaby. I haven't sung it in a while. Would you?" She began softly, the melody simple and old. The language wasn't one he knew, but it needed no translation. It sounded like wind through dry grass, like stars falling gently to earth. When she finished, Elias was quiet for a long moment. "I know a passage," he said, "that Clara used to say when she was afraid." He closed his eyes. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Nita nodded, eyes shining faintly. "That's a good one." "It helped her sleep," Elias said. Nita reached over, her fingers brushing his hand. Not holding, just resting. Elias didn't move. That moment, quiet, still, almost accidental, stretched like a thread between them.
Not a promise, not yet, but a possibility. Then she pulled her hand back, and the world exhaled. They rose, packed their things, and walked down the hill together, their tracks side by side in the soft snow. The knock came just after midday. Elias had been splitting firewood by the barn, the rhythm soothing in its repetition.
When he looked up, the man was already dismounted, his horse tied loosely to the post near the porch. He wore a fine hat, clean boots, no dust on his coat. "Mr. Ward," the man said smoothly, tipping the brim. "Name's Garrett Crawford. Might we talk a spell?" Elias nodded once. "We can talk." He set down the axe, wiping his hands on his trousers, and stepped forward slowly, deliberately. Behind the cabin window, a flicker of movement, Nita's shadow retreating into silence. Crawford smiled like a banker. "You've had some unexpected blessings, I hear," he said, gesturing toward the pasture where the cattle grazed. "Fine herd." "They're on my land," Elias replied, "and no one's come forward to claim them." "Well, I might have had an interest in some lost property myself," Crawford said, watching Elias's face carefully. "Not the cattle, mind you, something smaller, more valuable." Elias didn't respond. Crawford took off his gloves, slapping them softly against his palm. "A certain girl, maybe. Dark hair, quick temper. Went missing a while back. Word is she might have passed through these parts." Elias's voice was calm. "I wouldn't know. You see," Crawford continued, pacing a slow circle in the snow, "she and I have unfinished arrangements, some obligations, legal matters." Elias stepped closer, closing the space between them. His voice was steady steel. "A person ain't property in this territory, not anymore." Crawford's smile didn't fade. "Some debts go beyond paper, Mr. Ward. Families make promises. Promises have value." Elias folded his arms. "So does dignity." They stood in the cold for a moment, two men forged by different fires. Then Crawford said softly, "She's not safe here, you know. Men like me, we don't give up. Sooner or later, someone comes knocking harder." Elias tilted his head slightly, as if hearing something on the wind. Then he replied, "Psalm 27 says, 'The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?'" A pause. Then Crawford chuckled, shaking his head. "You're either brave or foolish, Mr. Ward." "I buried one wife on this land," Elias said. "I won't bury another." Crawford's smile cracked. For just a moment, the mask slipped. Then he turned sharply, mounted his horse with practiced ease, and looked back once. "Think on it," he said. "The snow gets deeper every day." With that, he rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the stillness. Elias stood for a long while, watching the place where the man had vanished. Inside the cabin, Nita waited, silent, breath held. When he entered, she looked up, searching his face. "He knows," she said simply. "He suspects," Elias replied. Nita sat down slowly by the hearth, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I should leave." Elias didn't answer immediately. He poured water into the kettle, set it on the fire, moving through the motions like a man anchoring his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I can't ask you to stay, but I also can't pretend I want you to go." Nita's eyes shimmered. "What we have, it isn't safe." "No," Elias said, "but it's real." They sat in the flickering light, the silence between them heavy with things unspoken, things too fragile, too sacred for words. Above the fire, a single verse from Clara's Bible remained pinned to the beam. "He sets the lonely in families." Psalm 68:6. And for the first time in years, Elias wondered if that promise might yet be kept. If you like this video, please comment number 1. If you don't like it, please comment number 2. Colorado Territory, late autumn, 1879. The knock came just after sunrise, not urgent, not hesitant, steady, like a man who already knew the answer to the question he'd come to ask. Elias opened the cabin door to find Sheriff there, coat dusted with frost, eyes heavy with a burden he hadn't spoken yet. "Elias," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "We found him, north of Black Mesa, Crawford." Elias didn't move. Alive? Dead. One shot. Clean. Distance work. No tracks but the horse he rode in on. Ledger books were in his saddlebag. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Sheriff Amos continued, voice lower now. "We finally got it all. Names, payments, girls he bought, sold, traded like cattle. You were right." Elias looked down at the cold ground, at the crack in the porch step Clara used to stub her toe on. He felt her absence again, but different this time, like she was standing beside him, waiting for his response. "Nita?" he asked. "She's safe for now," Amos said, "but this'll go federal. She'll be asked to testify, and if she does, they'll protect her." A long silence. "Or she could vanish," Amos added, "and none of it sees light." Elias closed the door behind him and stepped out onto the porch, hands in his coat. The land looked different today, not because it changed, but because he had. "She doesn't know yet?" "No, I wanted to tell you first." Elias nodded slowly. "You did right." He watched the sheriff ride off, then stood alone, boots heavy on the frosted planks. In the distance, the cattle shifted quietly in the field, like they too were waiting. Inside, Nita was still asleep, peaceful, unaware that the weight of justice now rested on her shoulders again. He didn't go inside, not yet. He sat on the porch step, rubbed his hands together. A single breath steamed into the cold, then another. What had begun with a wound in the canyon had led to this strange quiet before decision. He knew what was coming, and so did the earth, the sky, even the ghosts. There would be no turning back now. By late afternoon, the sky had turned brass-colored, that strange hue Colorado wore before snow, or some other change you could feel in your ribs. Elias saddled his mare slow, silent, as if each buckle were part of a prayer. He rode the familiar trail without thinking, past the old cottonwood tree, over the frozen wash, down the rise to the cemetery behind St. John's Chapel. He hadn't been since autumn began to bite, but the path knew his horse by habit. Clara's grave sat quiet, rimmed with dried grass and weather-worn stones. He dismounted, hat in hand. "I know I ain't come often," he whispered, "but I reckon you know why." He knelt. "I need to choose, Clara, not for me this time, for her." He reached inside his coat and pulled out the small Bible she used to carry, worn leather, thin like the pages inside had been read by shaking hands. When he opened it, a pressed violet slipped loose and landed on the dirt. It opened to a page marked long ago, with her faded handwriting underlining one verse. "The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delighteth in his way." Psalm 37:23. He stared at the line, not blinking, not breathing for a moment. "You'd say I already know the answer," he said softly. "You always did see things plainer than me." The wind stirred, not hard, just enough to lift the violet and lay it against the edge of the stone. He didn't cry. Not because it didn't ache, but because something deeper than grief had rooted inside him. It wasn't sorrow now, it was clarity. He stood, brushed off his knees. "Nita's gonna testify. She'll speak, and they'll listen, and I'll stand with her." The words felt right, solid. As he mounted his horse, he turned once more toward the grave. "I ain't replacing you, not ever, but maybe she was sent to remind me why I kept going when you left." He rode back faster than he came. The sun had dipped low, shadows lengthening across the field. When he reached the cabin, Nita stood on the porch, blanket around her shoulders, eyes sharp. "You went to see her," she said. Not a question. He nodded. "And I came back with your answer." They sat by the fire that night, not speaking at first. The only sound was the crackle of mesquite logs and the distant howl of winter settling into the hills. The light flickered across Nita's face, strong but quiet. Her hands rested in her lap, still as river stones. Elias had made coffee, even though neither of them drank much past sundown. It gave him something to hold. She finally spoke. "You know I could disappear. I know. I could go south.
Find the old railroad line. Get lost in Mexico before the marshals ever knock. You could." She turned toward him, and her voice didn't shake. "But I won't." Elias looked up, surprised, not at the choice, but at how steady it sounded in her mouth. "I've run long enough," Nita said. "It's time to stand." He said nothing, but the breath he let out wasn't one of relief. It was something deeper, almost reverence. She added, "If I don't say what happened, others will think they're alone. I won't let that happen." He stared into the fire a long moment, then set the cup down and said, "Then I'll be there. Every step." She smiled, just barely. "You already are." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed with something warm and real, not sudden, not reckless. Something that had been growing like roots beneath frost. She leaned her head against the log wall. Funny thing about hope. It doesn't shout, it just waits. He reached across the small space between them, not bold, just sure, and rested his fingers lightly atop hers. She didn't pull away. No words passed. They didn't need to. Out in the field, the cattle shifted again, the wind curling low like a hymn without words. Inside the cabin, two souls who had nearly given up on the world chose instead to give it one more try. In the corner, the lamp flickered low, but neither of them moved to refill the oil. For once, darkness didn't feel like the end. It felt like shelter. By the following morning, Elias had cleared off the kitchen table. He spread blank paper beside ink, set the Bible in the middle, though no one opened it just yet. They weren't writing sermons. They were preparing to speak the truth. Nita sat across from him, shoulders squared, voice calm as she repeated each fact. Dates, names, faces. Elias wrote, not questioning, only listening. He didn't flinch when she spoke of the cages, the bindings, the priest who pretended to save but brokered instead. He let her shape her own story. When she paused, he passed her a cup of hot chicory. Her hands wrapped around it like it held more than warmth, maybe memory, maybe something still trembling inside her, despite the calm. "That's enough for today," Elias said gently. "No," Nita replied. That was only the beginning. By midday, 2 federal agents arrived. Long coats, sharp hats, rifles worn from use. They spoke quietly, respectfully. Asked to review what she'd shared. Promised protection. One agent took the notes, the other gave her a token to carry, a brass medallion that marked her as witness under federal shield. "They won't reach you without going through us," the agent assured. But even with badges and law on their side, the air felt thinner now. Elias could sense it, in the way the town watched too long, in the whisper that followed them at the general store. Still, back at the cabin, peace lingered like the smell of bread left cooling on the window ledge. That night, she mended the loose button on his shirt, not because it mattered in court, but because it mattered to her. He watched her fingers work, and when she looked up, he whispered,
You've stitched more than cloth, you know." Her smile didn't rise to her lips, but it settled in her eyes. She didn't answer. In return, he brewed her coffee. Black, slightly sweet, the way she said her mother used to make it after hard days. They sat outside to drink it, wrapped in one old quilt between them.
The stars were sharp and near, as if watching over their little porch like quiet sentinels. He looked at her then, truly looked, and said, almost without breath, "You're my hope returned." She didn't reply, just leaned her shoulder against his, steady and silent. The fire started just after midnight. Not in the cabin, not in the barn, but near the fence line, a single bundle of sagebrush soaked in kerosene, lit and tossed beneath the mesquite tree by the north pasture. Elias smelled the smoke before he saw the glow. By the time he reached it with the bucket, the fire had barely caught, just a scorched patch of grass and one blackened fence post. But that wasn't the point. It wasn't meant to destroy. It was a message. He found the mark burned into the wood, a crude cattle brand, Crawford's initials reversed and slashed, a symbol not of ownership, but vengeance. When he returned to the cabin, Nita was already awake. She stood barefoot on the porch, shawl wrapped tight, face pale but still. "They're near," she said simply. He nodded. "And they want us to know it." He didn't light another lantern. He didn't go back to bed.
He pulled the old rifle from above the door, checked the chamber, and stepped out again, coat buttoned, hat pulled low. He walked the perimeter of the house, boots muffled in frost. By the corral he paused, stared out into the darkness. Nothing moved. But he felt it, that weight in the night air, awaiting. He climbed the ladder to the hayloft, the highest point on the farm. From there he could see the whole stretch of land, cabin, trees, creek beyond. He sat, rifle across his lap. And then he prayed. Not aloud, not desperate, just steady, like a man speaking to someone he knew was listening. "Lord," he thought, "I've been wrong more times than I can count, but not this time. She deserves peace. If they come, let it be me they meet." The wind picked up, scattering ash into the trees. He sat for hours, eyes wide, breath fogging. But no one came that night. Only the stars watched. Only the cattle stirred. Only the silence of men too afraid to face light. And as dawn crept low over the horizon, Elias felt something shift, not in the field, but inside him. He was no longer just protecting her. He was guarding something sacred. The courtroom in Denver wasn't grand, not like the ones in eastern cities, but it held weight all the same. Whitewashed walls, straight-backed pews, a judge whose eyes had seen enough to know what truth looked like, even when spoken through tears. Nita stood in the witness box. Elias sat just behind her, hat in his lap, jaw set. She wore the same shawl she'd arrived in months ago, mended, yes, but not replaced. It was part of her story now. Like the scar beneath her left wrist, like the stars she still traced in the dark. The questions came slow, formal, names, places, dates. She answered each with calm precision, not rehearsed, but clear. When they asked about Crawford, she didn't flinch. She spoke not of vengeance, but memory. "I speak," she said, "so the silence won't swallow others whole." A hush fell over the room. One of the ledgers was read aloud, each name inked in Crawford's own hand, a list not of property, but people. And suddenly the case wasn't about cattle or land, it was about souls. When her voice finally broke, not from weakness, but from the weight of it all, Elias rose behind her. He didn't touch her, didn't speak, just stood, still, steady.
A marshal in the back whispered, "That's the man who took her in." Another replied, "That's the man who wouldn't let her fall." By noon, the verdict was clear. Crawford's estate was to be seized, his network dismantled. The rest would go to federal hands. As they stepped out into the hallway, Nita looked up through the tall windows. Snow had begun to fall. Not hard, soft, slow, like heaven exhaling. Elias reached for her coat. She shook her head and stepped into the cold with face upturned. When they reached the steps outside, he offered her his arm. This time, she took it. They walked in silence. And in that silence, the words of the prophet rose unspoken, known but not shouted. Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Amos 5:24. Not as a flourish, not as victory, but as the echo of something older, deeper, and finally made real. Your thoughts truly matter. Don't hesitate to give this story a rating. Spring had come early that year. The snow melted quick, leaving the earth dark and rich beneath the hooves of cattle that still no one claimed. 20 heads, strong, healthy, grazing just north of the cabin like they'd always belonged. Elias never asked again who sent them. Some mysteries he'd come to believe weren't meant to be solved. Some were meant to be lived with, like grace undeserved. The ranch had grown, not in land, but in rhythm. The days found their beat again. Chickens, fence mending, ledger marking, the ordinary sacred things. Nita moved through it all like a song carried on wind. Steady, quiet, unforgettable. The townsfolk, once wary, now tipped hats and offered hands. Even Sheriff Amos began stopping by, not for threats, but for coffee and to drop off fresh mail with a nod. She was no longer the girl hiding behind shadows. She was the woman at the porch railing, braiding herbs, speaking to travelers, and smiling when the baby inside her shifted just so beneath her apron. Yes, baby. Elias still didn't quite believe it when she first told him. They'd stood near the barn, hands stained with axle grease from fixing the wagon wheel. She'd said it plain. "There's a little one coming, Elias." He'd dropped the wrench. Now the baby was almost here. And there was something else, too. Something Elias hadn't let himself hope for since Clara's death. A wedding. It wasn't much, no satin or organ hymns, just the cottonwood grove behind the stream, some simple benches borrowed from the church, and a sky so blue it made the land look baptized. Sheriff Amos presided, his voice softer than usual. A few townsfolk came. One old woman brought a pie. Another placed a hand-knit blanket across their joined hands. Nita wore a plain cream dress. Elias wore his old cavalry coat, cleaned and pressed. No ring, just vows. And when they said amen, Amos opened his Bible to a worn page and read, "And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." 1 Corinthians 13:13. There was no applause, just wind through the cottonwoods and a dove cooing in the boughs. Elias looked at Nita, not as someone rescued, not as someone redeemed, but as someone who had come home and brought the sky with her. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, boots kicking soft dust, hearts strangely light. Later that night, she rested beside him, one hand on her belly, one curled into his shirt. He whispered, "Thank you." She didn't ask for what, she just leaned closer. The stars outside blinked wide and clear. The cattle lowed in the distance. And somewhere in the hush, Elias thought he heard Clara's laughter, not as memory, but as blessing. She arrived on a Thursday just before dawn. The wind had quieted. The stars held their breath. Nita gripped Elias's hand so hard he thought his bones might break. And then she let go, just as the first cry pierced the cabin walls. A girl,
Dark hair, clear lungs, strong grip, like she already knew this world would ask much of her, and she meant to answer. They named her Clara Mita, not hyphenated on paper, but in the way they said it. One breath, one story, two legacies stitched into a single heartbeat. The doctor from town said mother and child were healthy, if a little stubborn. "Just like the both of you," he chuckled, wiping his hands. Elias stood back, unsure at first. He hadn't held a child since. But when Nita beckoned, he took the small, swaddled bundle. She didn't cry. She stared at him, wide, dark eyes like Nita's, but something gentler, too. Something he'd once seen in Clara when she read scripture aloud under lamplight. He whispered, "Hello there, little storm." And the baby smiled. That spring passed in a blur of lullabies, warm milk, and the ache of joy that always seemed too large for the room. They took turns waking. Nita sang in a language Elias didn't always understand. He read from Psalms, sometimes aloud, sometimes just in his heart. By June, Clara Nita had found her laugh. By July, she reached for her father's beard and yanked hard. He didn't mind. One morning, long after the dew had lifted, Elias stepped out with the child in a sling across his chest. The cattle, still 20 strong, moved through the northern field. No brands, no origins, just presence. He walked the fence line slowly, boots pressing into soft earth, eyes scanning the horizon. Behind him, the cabin stood quiet. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. A blue shawl fluttered on the porch rail. Nita leaned against the doorframe, one hand holding her coffee, the other resting just above her heart. She watched them, man and child, outlines against the pasture. Then she said, not loudly but clear enough to carry, "Maybe heaven walks on hooves, too." Elias turned, smiled. He looked at the child, at the land, at the sky. "I don't need to know how," he said softly. "I just know who." The wind shifted. The cattle turned. Somewhere in the cottonwoods, the dove cooed again. And Clara Nita blinked up at him, tiny fingers curling toward light. Join us in true Wild West stories, where dusty trails hold more than footsteps, and silence often speaks louder than gunfire. Each tale echoes lost love, quiet bravery, and the divine in everyday dust. Subscribe now and let the past remind your heart of what still matters most.